ever-expanding and interconnecting nature of our world, we as a generation have been dubbed the lonely generation due to our lack of meaningful relationships. However, can we purely blame our ineptitude to make purposeful and substantial connections with each other on the internet? Alienation and isolation, coupled with their ever-changing nature, is a human experience felt by adolescents, adults, and the elderly alike, and is one that has been felt throughout the centuries as outlined in Shakespeare's Ninth Sonnet, Winton's The Boy Behind the Curtain, and Jaboski's The Perks of Being a Wallflower. The fear of being rejected or alienated by our peers due to various social standards and cultural customs is an inherent fear deep-rooted within most humans due to our fundamental and collaborative traits. Over time, as society's expectations and norms change, our attitudes and emotions towards these expectations have changed, opening up entire corridors for us to feel we don't fit into. An example of this is in Shakespeare's Ninth Sonnet and how society's expectations today have changed surrounding the idea of being a spinster or not having children more generally. Shakespeare outlines in the second quatrain of his Ninth Sonnet how it would be a tragedy to not procreate and give your wife and the world your heirs. That thou consumest thyself in single life, if thou issueless hap to die, the world will wail thee in a makeless wife. The world will be thy widow and still weep. He is guilting his audience, using persuasive language in the form of imagery, into the traditional path of marrying and having children. He outlines that if they don't procreate, they would isolate themselves by a grieving society of their beauty, both during their lifetime and beyond the grave. But beauty's waste hath in the world an end. Another example in literature of the alienation of oneself is in Tim Winton's The Weight and the Flow. In this text, Winton describes his connection and love of surfing and how his daily life has always depended on the weather as to whether he can surf or not. Throughout this piece, we get an understanding of the Australian surfing subculture, its collective nature, as shown through the use of his collective language, i.e. us and we, and its role in the creation of Australia's national identity. However, throughout the chapter, Winton also speaks of how it's changed since when he first began on a foam board in the 1960s. In particular, he reveals how in the 1980s the entire culture changed from a wider, broader, softer, more fluid and emotional to one of sporting competitions and defiant morons who trashed beaches and scouted at each other on the break. This change in culture and the nature of the activity causes Winton to reject and alienate himself from the practice from which he found much joy, peace and calm. This alienation, however, is what enables him to rekindle his love for the sport and gives him a greater appreciation of its peacefulness and his own connection with the ocean when he returns to the beach in the 1990s. Whilst we do feel a certain social pressure and reasons to feel alienated from the collective, our main period of feeling isolated and alienated from our peers is in our adolescent years. This is a period in which we are finding ourselves and our lifelong friends, often causing us to have a heightened awareness of our image. Tim Winton experiences this in his chapter Betsy, where he explains how the Menzian abomination was a cause of much social anxiety and torment for both him and his siblings throughout their teenage years. Throughout this piece, Winton uses humour and relatable anecdotes to reflect the embarrassment and anxiety the minx created in his teenage image, especially around how it reflected on his coolness. When Winton first moves to the regional Western Australia, he sees the Hillman minx as a possible source of adolescent alienation, with the line, "I spent those brief trips finding a new way to slide so low in the passenger seat as to become invisible." However, eventually, Winton is able to overcome these fears and eventually sees the car as more of a joke and continuously uses humour throughout to show its eccentricities rather than its embarrassments. A similar theme of adolescent alienation can be found in Jaboski's The Perks of Being a Wallflower. This novel follows the coming-of-age story of Charlie, a severely traumatised teenager who begins his freshman year of high school after his best and only friend commits suicide. Throughout the novel, Charlie is alienated from his peers as shown by his relationships with both his siblings and those in his freshman year. Jaboski uses an interesting technique throughout the novel to show this isolation, and it's highlighted by this particular quote. By Jaboski telling Charlie's story in third person through letter writing, he is able to show Charlie's isolation and lack of understanding and communication with his peers due to his inability to relate and identify with their daily activities. In conclusion, alienation is a human experience in which we all endure, and authors often capture in order to give us light to this universal and ever-changing experience, whether it be in relation to procreating, cars, surfing, or the adolescent coming of age.